Before dawn on a gray summer morning in 1940, the English coast lay quiet beneath a low ceiling of cloud, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred the horizon into a single muted line. The tall steel mass of a chain-home radar station stood against the dim sky like rigid sentinels, their metal frames catching the first faint glow of day. Inside the operations hut, the air hummed with electricity and the soft crackle of equipment warming to life. Operators leaned over their scopes, their faces lit by pale green light, eyes tracing the wavering lines that marked the unseen. Across the channel, beyond the reach of any lookout's binoculars, the Luftwaffe was already forming up, wings locked, engines steady, climbing into position for the next strike against Britain. The radar room felt almost still, yet every person inside sensed that quiet rarely survived sunrise. Then, on one screen, a faint echo appeared, a distant pulse, barely there, but moving with purpose. In that moment, the station's silence became the first warning Britain would receive, and everything that followed began with that thin, flickering line. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone on the western edge of a continent that had collapsed with astonishing speed, its armies pushed from Dunkirk, its allies defeated, its navies stretched across distant oceans, and its cities bracing for an attack that seemed inevitable. The fall of France had transformed the map of Europe, bringing German airfields to the very edge of the Channel and placing the Luftwaffe in striking distance of every vital port, factory, and airfield in southern England. For the first time in modern history, an island nation that had relied for centuries on the natural barrier of the sea now faced an enemy able to cross it in minutes. The threat was not theoretical. Every dawn carried the possibility of a new raid. Yet while most of the world saw aircraft and bombs as the defining weapons of this new era, Britain had quietly built something different, an invisible early warning system stretching along its vulnerable coastline, a network that would determine whether the Royal Air Force could rise in time to meet the German attack. Only a few years earlier, this idea had existed as nothing more than experimental radio pulses bouncing across empty fields, tested by a handful of scientists who suspected that the air itself might reveal approaching machines. Led by Robert Watson Watt, these researchers had pushed the boundaries of what radio waves could detect, building crude apparatuses that flickered with static and ghostly shapes whenever an aircraft passed across their path. The concept had been unproven, the equipment unreliable, and the skepticism deep. Yet the urgency of rearmament and the looming threat from Nazi Germany had accelerated every step of development, turning fragile prototypes into standardized stations that soon lined the coast from the Isle of Wight to the Firth of Forth. These tall towers were not meant to be beautiful or discreet. They were functional pillars of a new form of warfare, transmitting powerful pulses that reached far out to sea and receiving the echoes that returned from metal wings long before human eyes could see them. By early 1940, this system, later known as the chain-home network, was nearly complete, its stations standing in quiet fields on windswept cliffs and behind small coastal towns where most residents barely noticed their presence. It was a marvel of improvisation and engineering, designed at speed, built with materials available, and staffed by operators who had learned to read the faintest distortions on their screens as if deciphering a whispered language. The war had changed the urgency of every task. Shifts were long, training constant, and the pressure immense. At a time when most military technologies were loud or visible, the roar of engines, the fire of guns, the glare of searchlights, this new tool worked in silence, watching not the land or sea, but the invisible patterns above them. For the Luftwaffe, whose doctrine relied on surprise and rapid concentration of air power, this silent watch posed an unprecedented challenge. But they did not yet understand its reach, nor its role in the British defense system. To many German planners, the tall towers were nothing more than radio masts or primitive communication structures, and they underestimated how deeply radar had been woven into the RAF's command hierarchy. In truth, the chain-home network had become the first crucial link in a larger structure that connected coastal stations to filter rooms, then to fighter command headquarters, then to individual sector stations that controlled each RAF squadron's movements. This was the architecture of survival for a nation bracing for air assault, a system that depended on timing measured not in hours but in minutes. Those minutes would determine whether fighter aircraft had time to scramble from their airfields, whether they could climb to the right altitude, and whether they could meet the enemy before bombs fell on cities, factories, and runways. Without early warning, the RAF risked losing aircraft on the ground, pilots caught unprepared, and airfields rendered unusable before the battle had even begun. With it, even outnumbered squadrons could choose when and where to fight, striking the enemy at altitude instead of reacting in chaos. Every piece of this defensive network relied on the accuracy and vigilance of the radar stations along the coast. Among them was one site in particular that watched a stretch of sea where German formations frequently assembled, a place where channel weather shifted quickly, where signals sometimes blurred, and where the responsibility for detecting the first echo of danger fell heavily on those who worked there. Their task was simple in description and immense in consequence. See the enemy early enough that Britain could respond. As the summer deepened and the Luftwaffe intensified its raids, the pressure on that quiet station grew, drawing it toward the moment when a single faint echo would carry the weight of an entire nation's defense and lead directly into the next stage of this unfolding struggle. Along the British coastline, each chain home station operated like a small, self-contained nerve cell connected to a far larger brain, its tall transmitter towers sending out powerful pulses while a separate set of receiving towers listened for the faintest hint of returning energy. Inside the operations hut, the atmosphere was a mixture of routine discipline and underlying tension, the kind that settled into the bones of those who spent long hours watching flickering traces sweep across their cathode ray screens. The equipment was simple by later standards. Heavy racks of valves, humming transformers, thick cables, and consoles that warmed the room with their steady electrical heat. Air smelled faintly of metal and dust, and everywhere there was the constant awareness that a missed signal could mean pilots failing to launch in time or bombs falling without interception. Most of the operators were young, many barely trained adults stepping into roles that demanded precision and calm under pressure. Their work was methodical, almost meditative. A blip too steady might indicate a ship. One too chaotic might be weather. But a growing, consistent echo at altitude, especially one appearing far out at sea, meant something entirely different. When such a trace emerged, the level of attention in the room sharpened instantly. The raw information from these scopes did not remain in the hut for long. As soon as an operator identified a possible formation, the data moved with near-realistic speed. A plotter marked its position, estimated its height, and relayed both to the regional filter room, where multiple stations' reports were compared, merged, and clarified into a single coherent track. This filtered view then flowed up the chain to Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, where the air battle over southern England was orchestrated minute by minute. There, in the Great Operations Room, the famous plotting table displayed the shifting symbols of raids seen first by the radar stations along the coast. Officers and controllers watched those symbols closely, calculating the moment when squadrons needed to be scrambled, how high they needed to climb, and how far ahead they needed to position themselves to make an effective interception. Without radar, these decisions would have been guesswork. With it, they could be timed with a precision that gave the RAF a fighting chance against a numerically superior Luftwaffe. The silent radar station at the center of our story was positioned on a portion of coastline exposed to the full width of the channel, its antennae overlooking waters that often churned with storms, fog banks, and shifting winds. From its vantage, operators could see deep into the air corridors used by German bombers assembling over northern France. This station had reported dozens of raids already, from probing reconnaissance flights to large formations testing British readiness. The people who worked there understood that their visibility varied by weather conditions, atmospheric interference, and the altitude of enemy aircraft. Low-flying planes might slip beneath the radar beam, while high-altitude formations returned signals that appeared long before any sound reached the coast. But despite limitations, the station's value was unquestionable. Every day, its teams stood watch over the sea, their screens mapping patterns of movement beyond the reach of any lookout or patrol. Tension grew in late July and early August as Luftwaffe activity increased noticeably. More aircraft gathered over airfields around Calais, Abbeville, and the Pas-de-Calais region. German commanders refined their timing for large-scale raids, seeking to overwhelm the British system with sheer volume and coordinated assaults. The station's operators began seeing unusual echoes, larger assemblies forming farther out, lingering as if waiting for orders. Reports of these sightings moved quickly up the chain, contributing to the broader intelligence picture that Fighter Command used to anticipate when the decisive phase of the campaign might begin. For those inside the hut, the routine hum of machinery gained an edge, as if the equipment sensed what the people already felt. The channel was becoming the front line. Every shift brought new signs that a major offensive was close, perhaps days away. It was during this buildup, under skies thick with humidity and tension, that the station prepared for the day when a single echo would emerge from the static, stronger, larger, unmistakable, and announce the beginning of the Luftwaffe's next great strike toward the English coast. The men and women inside the radar station lived within a quiet tension that rarely eased, carrying out their work with a discipline that belied their youth. Most were barely past adolescence, recruited from towns and villages that dotted the coast, trained quickly, and placed before equipment that demanded more responsibility than many had ever imagined. They learned to read faint distortions on cathode ray, screens the way seasoned navigators read the sea, memorizing the rhythm of the beam's sweep, the pulse of returning echoes, and the subtle differences between a scattered cluster of small traces and the emerging signature of a bomber formation gathering at altitude. Their days unfolded in cycles of intense focus, broken only by short pauses when someone brought tea or when a senior operator leaned over a shoulder to verify a reading. The routine appeared monotonous to an outsider, but for those inside the hut, every moment carried the knowledge that a single misread signal could leave an entire British sector exposed. The human angle was defined by this mix of youth, responsibility, and invisible pressure. No aircraft engines thundered overhead, no bombs fell nearby, yet their hands and eyes shaped the survival of pilots who depended on those early warnings. Many operators later recalled the emotional distance they tried to maintain, detaching themselves from the realization that every trace they plotted would send men into battle. Still, the weight pressed in on quiet nights, when the room glowed softly and the only sound was the steady sweep of the beam, reminding them that danger moved in the darkness beyond the coastline, whether the world outside appeared peaceful or not. The technological dimension of the radar station told a different side of the same story. Chain Home was a system born from urgency, assembled with equipment that was robust but primitive by later standards, relying on fixed antenna towers that sent low-frequency radio waves far across the channel. The station's transmitter tower, tall and skeletal, blasted its signal into the sky, the energy spreading outward in wide arcs. A separate receiving tower captured the faint echoes returning from distant aircraft, converting them into traces on a screen that needed human interpretation to make sense. These beams did not pinpoint altitude with precision, and they struggled with low-flying aircraft, yet they possessed a reach unmatched by any other defensive tool available in 1940. The system could see past the horizon, detecting German bombers while they still circled over their French bases or while they crossed the narrow waters of the Channel in tight formation. This early visibility altered the mathematics of the air war. Instead of relying on observers scanning the skies or listening devices amplifying distant engine noise, Britain now had a way to measure speed, bearing, distance, and approximate strength long before the enemy arrived. Radar did not need to be sharp or elegant. It needed to be early. Those minutes of forewarning were the oxygen that allowed Fighter Command to breathe, to scramble pilots, warm engines, clear runways, and lift Spitfires and Hurricanes into the sky with enough altitude to challenge the oncoming raid. This crude, humming machine, with its room-sized components and flickering screens, represented the birth of a new form of warfare in which information became as vital as firepower. And the struggle was won not by powerful guns alone, but by the ability to see first. Within Fighter Command's operation structure, the radar station functioned as one part of a delicate chain whose success depended entirely on timing. Once echoes appeared on the station's scopes, the information traveled quickly to filter rooms, where teams cross-check reports from multiple stations, removing duplication and uncertainty. From there, a clearer picture emerged that officers used to track the developing raid. This picture was then transmitted to sector stations, each responsible for directing RAF squadrons in its region. These sector controllers held a difficult position, balancing limited resources against constant threats and deciding when to commit their fighters to battle. If the radar stations reported too early or too late, the entire structure faltered. Too early, and pilots wasted fuel circling in empty skies. Too late, and they rolled down their runways with enemy bombs already falling around them. The flow of information needed to be smooth and precise, a rhythm that turned distant pulses on a radar screen into coordinated action across Britain's defensive system. The radar station at the center of our story was known for consistent reporting and for its strategic position along a common Luftwaffe approach route. When it detected something unusual, the rest of the system paid attention. The people inside understood their role in Fighter Command's wider strategy, aware that their readings could decide whether squadrons from Tangmere, Kinley, or Biggin Hill rose with the advantage or were caught unprepared. This connection between their silent room and the aircraft climbing into sunlight gave their work a gravity they rarely spoke about, but always felt. All these angles, the human, the technological, the command-centered, merged into a single truth. The radar station was not simply a building filled with equipment. It was the first link in a defensive chain that relied on its accuracy, vigilance, and speed. Every shift, every reading, every faint echo mattered, especially as the Luftwaffe increased its activity across the channel. The operators sensed the pattern changing, felt the tension shift, and saw the traces growing larger and more frequent on their screens. They knew that at any moment, a signal might appear that was unmistakable, a mass of echoes moving with purpose, large enough to suggest a major raid. When that moment came, their actions would set the tempo of Britain's defense. And as the summer days wore thin and the skies grew heavier with incoming danger, the station braced for the echo that would signal the beginning of a decisive confrontation, one that would lead directly into the next phase of the unfolding battle. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe assembled its strength with confidence shaped by victories won on open fields across Europe, believing that Britain's defenses were limited to ground observers, binoculars, and scattered sound detection devices that offered little reliability. German crews planned their raids around the assumption that surprise remained one of their greatest weapons, convinced that their formations could slip across the narrow waterway before the RAF had time to climb into the fight. They knew the British radar towers existed, but misinterpreted them as crude radio masts, unaware that those steel frames carried an early warning system capable of tracing their movements even as their engines warmed on French airfields. Luftwaffe doctrine had been built on the success of concentrated power, tight formations of bombers protected by Messerschmitt fighters, striking quickly and retreating before sustained resistance could form. The Channel, however, introduced a new dimension. While German aircraft crossed it with confidence, Britain's radar stations tracked them almost from the moment they left the ground. German crews flying at altitude believed the empty sky ahead meant secrecy, but in reality their position, size, and bearing were already being plotted by unseen hands on glowing screens miles away. This gap between perception and reality became one of the defining imbalances of the Battle of Britain, a blind spot that no amount of training or bravery could overcome. The moral and psychological angle of the radar war added another layer to the unfolding conflict. On the ground, British civilians moved through their routines unaware that the protection of entire regions often rested on signals too faint for human senses, guided by operators who never fired a shot, yet influenced the course of every engagement. The radar stations acted as guardians no one could see, shielding towns and airfields by providing precious minutes of preparation. For the Luftwaffe, this invisibility was deeply unsettling, even if they did not fully understand its source. Pilots would later describe moments when RAF fighters seemed to appear impossibly early or from unexpected angles, as though guided by knowledge beyond ordinary reconnaissance. For the radar operators, the emotional distance they attempted to maintain often faltered in quiet moments between raids, when the glow of their screens cast long shadows on the walls and the weight of their responsibility felt heaviest. They could not see the pilots who depended on them, nor the civilians beneath the flight paths of the bombers they tracked, but every pulse they detected widened the margin of survival. Their actions created a protective bubble around the island, one shaped not by walls or guns, but by invisible geometry, bearings, altitudes, closing speeds, measured and communicated in time-sensitive bursts. It was a new kind of warfare, fought not with weapons, but with information, where the calm precision of an operator's voice could mean the difference between interception and devastation. Strategically, the radar network shifted the balance of air power in ways that transformed the very nature of the campaign. The advantage did not lie in overwhelming force, but in time, those narrow slices of minutes between detection and interception that allowed the RAF to control altitude, choose engagement points, and avoid wasteful scrambling. Without radar, British fighters would have been forced into constant patrols, burning fuel and exhausting pilots who were already stretched thin. With radar, every climb became purposeful. Squadrons rose only when raids were confirmed, conserving energy for the moments that mattered. Fighter command could track multiple incoming formations, prioritize targets, and commit aircraft where they were needed most, preventing the Luftwaffe from achieving local superiority despite their numerical advantage. This precision allowed the RAF to fight a measured battle, trading unpredictability for strategic discipline. The value of an extra 5 or 10 minutes cannot be overstated. It changed the altitude at which fighters engaged, determined how many could assemble in time, and dictated whether they struck the bombers before or after they released their payloads. Radar turned the skies into a calculated space rather than a chaotic one, giving Britain the rare ability to anticipate rather than react. All these angles converged as the summer of 1940 reached its critical phase. The Luftwaffe intensified preparations for larger, coordinated strikes aimed at crippling the RAF's ability to defend southern England. German commanders believed that by concentrating force, they could overwhelm British defenses and open the door for a possible invasion. Yet the radar stations along the coast watched these patterns develop in real time, tracking the growing formations gathering over France, reading the shifting currents of air movement that revealed when a major raid was imminent. The silent radar station at the center of this narrative sensed the coming change before most others, its screens showing traces that grew stronger, more numerous, and more deliberate each passing day. Operators recognized the signs. Bombers forming earlier in the morning, fighters circling longer before escorting them across the channel, and multiple units converging in patterns that suggested something larger than routine harassment. They felt the tension rise inside the hut, the subtle tightening of voices and the sharpened focus that came when the air itself seemed to tremble with unspoken warning. All indications pointed toward an approaching moment when a massive formation would surge across the water, and the station would be the first to see it. That echo would mark the transition from preparation to confrontation, carrying the weight of a nation's defense into the decisive hours ahead and leading directly into the climax of this unfolding battle. On an August morning in 1940, the air above the channel settled into an uneasy stillness, the kind that filled the radar huts along the coast with a quiet more piercing than noise. At the station overlooking one of the busiest approach corridors, operators took their positions as the transmitter towers cast long shadows across the field outside. Dawn had barely lifted, yet the room was already warm from the constant hum of equipment. The beams swept across the screen in its steady rhythm, tracing arcs that for a time showed nothing more than the usual clutter, weather patterns, distant ships, and the faint distortions that came from atmospheric interference. Then, almost imperceptibly, a new echo appeared at extreme range. It pulsed weakly at first, nothing more than a small rise in the line, the sort that required a second and third look. An operator leaned closer, adjusting the gain, watching the trace return at the same point on the next sweep. The echo was consistent, and with each rotation it grew a little stronger, a little more defined. Another operator confirmed it, marking the position on the plotting table. A minute later, a second echo joined the first, then a third, emerging like faint footsteps approaching across invisible ground. Within moments, it became clear that this was not a random cluster, but the beginning of a formation, large, deliberate, and far out over the channel. Voices sharpened, but remained controlled as the data moved through the room. Bearing, distance, height estimate, number of aircraft, each detail was relayed with practiced precision. The raid was approaching from the Pas-de-Calais region, a direction already known for hosting the Luftwaffe's heaviest concentrations. The filter room received the report and quickly cross-referenced it with signals from neighboring stations. Their combined readings revealed a pattern impossible to mistake. A significant force was assembling, still too distant to be seen by observers on the coast, yet unmistakably real on the radar screens glowing inside the silent hut. Operators tracked the development in real time, watching the formation tighten and expand as it gained altitude. It grew steadily, measuring wider on each sweep, the echoes merging into a dense, persistent mass. The estimate climbed into the dozens, then the scores. This was no probe or reconnaissance flight. It was a major raid forming with disciplined purpose. The urgency in the room shifted from awareness to confirmation. Reports moved swiftly up the chain, reaching the group headquarters responsible for several key airfields in the south. Controllers, already prepared for a day of heightened activity, quickly interpreted the significance. A raid of this size could only have one objective: a strike intended to weaken Fighter Command's ability to respond effectively, perhaps aimed at airfields, radar sites, or cities deeper inland. At Bentley Priory, the nerve center of Fighter Command, the filtered report reached the operations room, where the massive plotting table displayed the evolving air battle. The symbol representing the new raid appeared as operators pushed it across the map, accompanied by a rising hum of activity around the table. Officers leaned over the developing picture, aligning altitude estimates with previous intelligence that suggested the Luftwaffe was preparing for larger, more destructive attacks. The timing matched German patterns, formations assembling shortly after dawn, crossing the channel with fighter escorts positioned to challenge the RAF at higher altitudes. The controllers calculated how long it would take the raid to reach the coast, then how long before it passed inland. Those calculations determined everything: the moment squadrons needed to scramble, how high they had to climb, and where they should intercept the oncoming force. The value of those early radar readings became clear. The raid was still tens of miles from land, giving the British a narrow but vital window in which to respond. Inside the sector stations, phones rang and orders cut through the morning air. Pilots were summoned to their aircraft, mechanics rushed to final checks, and engines began to roar across the runways. Hurricanes and Spitfires taxied into position as the sound of their engines vibrated through the airfields. Back at the radar station, the operators continued tracking the raid with unwavering focus. The echoes grew stronger as the formation advanced, revealing not just bombers, but their fighter escorts flying above and ahead. The size of the force suggested a coordinated strike meant to overwhelm defenses through sheer weight. Yet thanks to the early detection, the RAF would not be caught on the ground. The beams swept the screens, and the operators called out adjustments in bearing and altitude with measured clarity, their voices steady despite the knowledge that their readings would shape the battle unfolding in the sky. The formation moved closer to the coast, still unseen by civilians in nearby towns, but entirely visible to the silent watchers in the hut. time compressed into a series of precise measurements. 5 minutes to landfall, then 4, then 3. In those minutes, RAF fighters lifted off, climbing into the upper layers of morning haze, gathering altitude for the confrontation ahead. The radar room felt suspended between two worlds, the unseen one on their screens and the visible one outside the hut where the towers stood against the brightening sky. And as the massive raid neared the shoreline, the warning that had begun as a faint, flickering echo had already set Britain's defense into motion, carrying the station's vigilance into the air where the decisive moments were now waiting. As the German formation reached the edge of the English coastline, the sky above the channel shifted from quiet gray to a layered battlefield waiting to ignite, though most civilians below still saw only drifting clouds and the pale shimmer of early sunlight. The Luftwaffe's bombers advanced in tight, disciplined groups, Dornier and Heinkel crews maintaining formation while their escorting Messerschmitts circled above like sharp, restless shadows. They believed surprise remained on their side. The channel crossing had been smooth, and no British fighters yet appeared in the distance. But the assumption collapsed within minutes. As the bombers closed in on land, climbing to their attack altitude, thin silhouettes emerged high on the horizon. First a pair, then a line, then an entire swarm of British fighters streaking in from the west and southwest. It took a moment for the German crews to realize what was happening. The RAF was not scrambling beneath them. It was already at altitude, already positioned for interception, already ready to strike before the bombers crossed deeper inland. Inside cockpits, disbelief mixed with frustration. Many German pilots later recalled how British fighters seemed to materialize from nowhere, not from below as expected, but from the very angles designed to disrupt escort coverage. The early warning delivered by the radar station had placed the RAF not just in the fight, but in the optimal place to break the formation before the bombers reached their targets. The first clash unfolded in a sudden, violent burst of motion. Spitfires dove at the escorts, using their maneuverability to challenge the Messerschmitts above, while Hurricanes surged toward the bomber stream. Their heavier armament aimed at the formations that posed the greatest threat to Britain's ground defenses. Engines howled across the sky, leaving thin contrails that twisted into disordered spirals as fighters banked, climbed, and rolled through the melee. The shock to the German formation was immediate. The tight bomber groups began to waver, their straight lines bending as pilots struggled to maintain cohesion under the weight of sudden attack. Escort fighters peeled away to meet the RAF, fracturing the protective umbrella that the bombers relied on. A single break in formation created ripples through the ranks. Once cohesion faltered, the bombers became more vulnerable to the Hurricanes sweeping in with broad, decisive arcs. Several aircraft took hits within minutes of the first interception. Thin strands of smoke trailed behind damaged engines, some spiraling downward toward the sea, others limping back toward France. The precision and timing of the British attack were unmistakable. This was not a desperate scramble from the ground, but a coordinated interception guided by information gathered long before the first German aircraft approached the coast. Below, the radar station remained at full concentration, continuing to track the raid even as reports filtered back from sector controllers about the developing battle overhead. The operators inside the hut did not see the dogfights firsthand, but they understood the significance of each adjustment they made to the plotted bearings. Every shift in the raid's position indicated how deeply the RAF had disrupted the formation. The echoes on the screens began to break apart, reflecting the scattered, uneven shape of the German attack. What had entered British airspace as a single, dense mass now appeared as a fragmented pattern of smaller clusters, some veering inland, others turning back toward the channel, their symmetry lost. The system that connected the radar station to fighter command allowed the British to reinforce the most critical areas. Additional squadrons were directed to intercept remnants of the raid, attempting to push toward inland targets. Those fighters climbing from sector airfields arrived in time partly because the early detection provided controllers with a minute-by-minute understanding of the raid's shifting geometry. For the Luftwaffe crews still pressing forward, the battle grew increasingly chaotic. Bombers attempted to maintain course, but the coordinated pressure from hurricanes forced many to release their payloads early or scatter in hopes of finding clearer air. Fighter escorts, pulled into extended combat with Spitfires, struggled to maintain cover. Pilots on both sides fought amid the roar of engines and bursts of tracer fire, climbing and diving through patches of sunlight that flickered across the channel like broken mirrors. Every minute of combat revealed the same simple truth. The RAF had arrived early enough to challenge the raid before it reached decisive ground targets. Without those minutes bought by radar, the Luftwaffe might have reached critical airfields and supply centers with less resistance, striking runways, hangars, and command posts essential to the British defense. Instead, the German formation found itself in a battle it had not anticipated, facing fighters already in position, already prepared, already climbing at equal or greater altitude. The shock of this interception radiated through every cockpit, and by the time the battle began to drift southward and eastward toward the channel, the raid's cohesion had unraveled beyond recovery. As the remaining German aircraft retreated toward France, the skies slowly cleared, leaving drifting columns of smoke rising from the waves and distant thunder in the air. The radar station that had first detected the massive formation continued to track the final echoes until they faded beyond range, the screens returning to the familiar pulse of ordinary signals. Inside the hut, the operators exhaled as one, the quiet returning with a weight shaped by everything they knew but could not see. Their early detection had allowed Britain's fighters to meet the enemy with altitude and readiness, changing the shape of the battle before the first shot had been fired in the sky, and carrying the conflict into its next phase, where consequences and calculations awaited. When the echoes finally faded from the radar screens and the last of the retreating German aircraft slipped beyond the horizon, Britain took its first steady breath of the day, though the scent of cordite and burning oil drifted inland from the coast like a grim reminder of what had unfolded overhead. In the immediate aftermath, Fighter Command began gathering reports from squadrons that had engaged the raid, piecing together the chaotic narrative of a battle fought at high altitude and over a wide swath of sky. Pilots returning to their airfields climbed down from their aircraft with faces marked by exhaustion and windburn, some barely speaking as ground crews surrounded them for damage assessments. They reported breaking into the bomber stream before the Luftwaffe could settle into its attack run, catching several Dornier and Heinkel formations off balance and forcing them into defensive maneuvers earlier than expected. Many pilots commented on the unusual advantage they felt during the first moments of contact, noting that they had reached the optimal altitude for interception, something that could only have happened with timely scrambling from their bases. Hurricanes returned with scorched paint from close-range engagements, while Spitfires landed with empty ammunition belts, their brief but intense duels with the Messerschmitts stretching across bright channels of cloud and sunlight. Controllers in the sector stations compared these first-hand accounts with the radar data recorded during the raid. They confirmed what the operators of the silent radar station had already understood in those earliest minutes. The warning had come early enough to shift the entire dynamic of the engagement. Instead of being forced to claw upward from low altitude or rise under the pressure of approaching bomb loads, RAF squadrons arrived at fighting height with time to spare. This allowed them to strike at the bombers before the formation gained the stability it relied upon to carry out accurate attacks. The echoes that had once appeared as a single dense mass on the radar screens had broken apart into smaller, scattered groups by the time many of the pilots met them, a sign that the initial interception had achieved its purpose. Reports accumulated at Fighter Command headquarters throughout the afternoon, showing the scale of disruption inflicted on the Luftwaffe's mission. Several bombers had been shot down over the channel, their crews rescued or captured only if they managed to ditch close enough to German patrol routes. Others attempted emergency landings along the French coast, their damaged engines unable to complete the return journey. British losses were acknowledged with solemn clarity. Aircraft had been lost, some pilots did not return, and their empty places on the squadron rosters underscored the cost of every engagement. Yet the balance of losses favored the defenders, and more importantly, the strategic outcome of the raid was clear. The Luftwaffe had failed to deliver its intended blow. The airfields targeted by the formation remained operational, their runways intact, their command structures unbroken. Intelligence officers later noted that the disruption caused by the timely interception likely saved several key installations from severe damage, preventing further strain on the already stretched resources of Fighter Command. Newspaper reports in the following days spoke cautiously of stout defense and timely action, careful not to reveal the existence or role of radar, but the tone within the service was unmistakably confident. The system had held. The warning had arrived in time. The RAF had met the enemy on equal footing and forced him back across the channel. At the radar station itself, the quiet that followed the battle carried a different kind of weight. Operators who had tracked the formation from its earliest flicker watched the screens resume their soft, repetitive sweep, the familiar background noise returning as if the skies had been cleansed of danger. They knew the battle's outcome only through delayed reports and signals passed through the chain of command, but they understood deeply that their first detection had shaped every moment that followed. The station's success reinforced the growing recognition within Fighter Command that radar was not simply a tool, but the foundation of the entire defensive system, a foundation that had proven its worth on a morning when minutes had mattered most. That awareness spread quietly through the ranks, setting the stage for how Britain would interpret and respond to the shifting patterns of air war in the days ahead, leading naturally into a broader understanding of how this single engagement fit into the larger struggle for control of the skies. In the hours and days that followed the raid, the consequences rippled far beyond the coastline, where the radar station first detected the approaching formation. Fighter Command analysts studied the patterns of the engagement, comparing timing, altitude, and interception points with the broader intelligence picture that had been forming throughout the summer. The early warning provided by the radar station fit seamlessly into the narrative that Britain's air defense was no longer reacting blindly to German attacks, but shaping the rhythm of the air war itself. Reports from multiple sources reinforced the same conclusion. The Luftwaffe had been forced to abandon its intended targets and withdraw with fewer victories and greater losses than expected, a result that chipped away at its confidence in achieving air superiority over southern England. German commanders, reviewing the raid from their bases in northern France, expressed frustration at the RAF's ability to meet their formations with such precision, often noting in their assessments that British fighters appear to be waiting at the correct altitude instead of struggling upward from scattered airfields. Though the Luftwaffe had yet to understand the full nature of Britain's radar system, the repeated failure of surprise attacks raised questions among some officers, who wondered whether their intelligence had overlooked a critical factor enabling the RAF to intercept with remarkable consistency. Within Britain, the impact of the successful defense reached into the strategic core of the Battle of Britain. Radar's contribution remained a guarded secret, a carefully protected advantage known only to those within the command structure. Public statements described the RAF's skill and readiness, while officials emphasized the bravery of the pilots and the dedication of ground crews, omitting the invisible architecture that had orchestrated every response. Yet behind closed doors, leaders within Fighter Command and the Air Ministry understood that radar had become the decisive edge. Airfields, spared from destruction, continued launching fighters without interruption. Maintenance crews repaired damaged aircraft without facing compounded devastation from repeated, unchallenged raids. Sector controllers refined their techniques for vectoring squadrons with increasing precision, learning to interpret radar-based intelligence with a clarity that grew sharper after each engagement. The battle was turning into a contest of endurance, and every successful interception increased Britain's resilience while draining German strength. Analysts noted that the Luftwaffe's losses, both in machines and experienced crews, were beginning to strain its operational tempo. Intelligence from French ports indicated damaged bombers crowding repair facilities, while replacement aircraft struggled to match the pace demanded by high-intensity operations. This particular raid, detected first by a single coastal station, played a symbolic role in this evolving pattern. It demonstrated how a few extra minutes of preparation could shift the course of an entire day's operations, preserving airfields, protecting command posts, and enabling the RAF to allocate its squadrons efficiently rather than squander resources in disorganized scrambles. More importantly, it reinforced the belief within fighter command that the integrated network of radar, filter rooms, and sector stations was not just functioning, but thriving under pressure. The system was proving its concept. Early detection led to timely scrambling. Timely scrambling led to strategic positioning. Strategic positioning led to effective interceptions, and effective interceptions undermined the Luftwaffe's campaign one raid at a time. Each step depended on the previous one, forming a chain of actions as interlinked and essential as the radar towers themselves. The silent station that had caught the first glimmer of this massive formation became a quiet symbol within the service, a reminder that the war's turning points were not always marked by explosions or dramatic scenes, but by the calm focus of operators reading faint signals before the world outside even knew danger was coming. By the end of that week, the Luftwaffe intensified its efforts once more, preparing for heavier waves meant to break fighter command through sheer attrition. Yet the British system, strengthened by the confidence gained from each successful interception, stood ready. Radar stations along the coast resumed their constant vigil, their towers rising over fields and cliffs like patient guardians of the horizon. The operators at our featured station returned to their screens, aware that the next decisive moment might arrive at any time. And as the broader struggle for air superiority pressed forward, the significance of that single early warning settled into the foundation of Britain's defensive strategy, guiding how leaders interpreted intelligence and prepared for what lay ahead, setting the stage for the final reflection on what this moment meant within the larger history of the war. When historians look back at the Battle of Britain, they often focus on the dramatic dogfights, the silhouettes of Spitfires cutting across sunlit skies, and the courage of pilots who rose again and again to defend their island. Yet behind those visible moments stood something quieter, something without shape or sound, something that changed the course of the war long before the first contrails tangled in the morning air. The silent radar station that detected the faint echoes of an approaching raid was not a monument built for glory. It was a simple hut filled with operators who worked in near darkness, listening to the hum of valves and watching the slow pulse of a beam across a screen. Their world was one of precision and patience, where meaning emerged from faint disturbances on glass, and where victory took the form of minutes gained rather than territory taken. Those few minutes were everything. They allowed pilots to climb fast enough to meet the enemy on equal terms. They protected airfields that could not be replaced. They preserved the fragile balance of a nation fighting for the right to remain unbroken. The work done within those radar rooms marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one where information moved as powerfully as steel and where unseen signals shaped decisions that would echo long after the battle ended. In the quiet aftermath of each raid, when the last traces faded from the screens and the room returned to its steady hum, the operators rarely thought of themselves as part of something historic. But the towers outside their windows stood watch day after day, and the pulses they generated formed an invisible shield that helped keep Britain standing when defeat seemed only a breath away. The legacy of that silent station lives not in monuments, but in the understanding that sometimes the smallest, calmest moments, minutes carved out of static and vigilance, hold the weight of history within them.